Why didn't you ask for help? Not whispered. Not soft. Controlled. Like a question already knows the answer and doesn't care what you say. Vile Morning didn't flinch when he heard it in his head for the 1000th time. He just pulled the smallest boy tighter against his chest and pressed his back harder into the cold warehouse wall. 3 children. Identical. Bone thin. Eyes too wide for faces that small. The warehouse off Caldera Street hadn't been used in years. The floor was cracked concrete, damp in the corners, and the air had that specific kind of cold that doesn't just touch your skin, it settles into your joints and stays. Rust flaked off the old shelving racks. A broken skylight let in a thin, crooked slice of grey afternoon light. Nobody came here. That was the point. The 3 boys, Vile had started calling them Dax, Cree, and Ren in his head because they needed names even if nobody else would give them one. Had been here when he arrived 4 days ago. Curled together like 3 question marks against the far wall. No crying. No screaming. Just waiting. That silence had hit Varel harder than anything else. He knew that silence. He had lived inside it for most of his 22 years. The silence of an Omega who had learned, through enough pain, that making noise didn't bring comfort. It only brought attention. And attention, for someone like him, was never the good kind. So he recognized it in them immediately. And he stayed. He hadn't planned to. He'd come to the warehouse to sleep somewhere that wasn't a shelter, somewhere the other Omegas wouldn't stare at him or ask why he never spoke. He had his reasons for silence. 342 days of reasons, stacked on top of each other like unpaid debts. But then the smallest boy, Dax, had turned those enormous dark eyes toward him. And didn't look away. Vile had set down his pack. Pulled out the last half of a gas station sandwich he'd been saving. Broke it into 3 pieces. Held it out. None of them moved at first. Then, slowly, Ren reached forward. Took a piece. Didn't eat it immediately, he handed it to Cree first. The middle brother. The one whose hand shook the most. Vile had to look away for a second. Hi viewers, have you ever met someone who couldn't speak, but their silence told you everything you needed to know? Drop a comment below and tell me about it. That first night, Varel sat with his back to the shelving rack and hummed. Low. Barely sound at all, more vibration than music. An old thing he did when the world got too loud inside his head. No melody, just rhythm. Like a heartbeat made audible. Dax crawled closer without realizing he was doing it. Then Cree. Then Ren. By the time morning came, all 3 boys were asleep against Varel's sides, tucked under his coat. His fingers were numb. His back ached from the concrete. And he had never in recent memory felt less alone. Sometimes people don't cry for help because no one ever answered before. He kept them fed on what he could find. Half a bag of crackers from a dumpster 2 blocks over. A bottle of water from a leaking pipe in the back hallway. 3 bruised apples from a crate left outside a closed grocery store. Not enough. Never enough. But more than nothing. And nothing had been the alternative. On the 2nd day, he noticed the marks. He'd been rubbing warmth back into Ren's wrists when he saw it. A small mark on the inside of his right wrist, not a bruise, not a scar. A brand. Deliberate. Faint, like it had been done when the skin was very young. He checked Cree's wrist. Same mark. Dax's. Same. 3 identical boys. 3 identical marks. Vile traced the shape with his thumb without pressing. It looked almost like a crown split into 3 pieces. Each section broken apart, like something whole that had been deliberately divided. He didn't know what it meant. But the part of him that had survived this long, the part that had learned to read danger before it announced itself, that part went very still. Day 3 passed quietly. Day 4 started the same way. Then came the evening of day 4. Vial heard it first. Not sound exactly. More like a shift. The way the air pressure in a room changes when a door opens somewhere far away. The boys felt it too. Dax lifted his head and went rigid, and that alone was enough to make Varel's chest tighten. Footsteps outside. He held his breath and counted them. 1, 2, 3 sets. But that wasn't what made the hair rise on the back of his neck. It was the rhythm. Synchronized. Perfectly. Like they had been walking together so long that breathing the same air had made them move as one. Not random. Not lost. Not looking for shelter from the cold. These footsteps knew exactly where they were going. The warehouse door, the big rolling one facing the street, didn't creak when it moved. It just opened. And the temperature in the room dropped another 10 degrees without explanation. Vial pulled all 3 boys behind him in one motion. Arms wide. Back straight. Eyes on the dark gap of the entrance. 3 figures stepped through. And the air stopped moving entirely. The black cars had pulled up without a sound. No tire squeal. No engine rev. Just the soft displacement of fresh snow as 3 identical vehicles rolled to a stop in front of the warehouse, and then went completely still, like they were waiting for permission to exist in this space. For minutes passed. Then the first door opened. He stepped out like the cold had no authority over him. Tall, not just physically, though physically he was the kind of tall that makes a room feel smaller. But tall in the other way. The way some men carry themselves, like the ground they walk on has already decided to cooperate. Dark coat, no scarf, no concession to the temperature. His boots pressed into the snow and didn't slip. His name was Cairo Vos Ashford. Not that Varel knew that yet. The second door. Identical face. Identical build. Different energy, coiled where the first was still. This one's jaw was set harder, scanning the perimeter before his feet had fully cleared the vehicle. He moved like someone who had learned that patience was a luxury and had given it up a long time ago. Zephyr. The second Alpha. The third door. The third brother stepped out last and said nothing, which somehow made him the loudest presence of the 3. Where Cairo was controlled and Zephyr was restless, this one, Darian, was simply watching. Taking in everything. Filing it away. His eyes moved the way a camera lens moves. Slow. Precise. Missing nothing. 3 Alpha Kings. Triplets. And the moment they crossed the threshold of that warehouse, the air in the building changed so fast it was almost physical. Like being pressed on from all sides at once. Vial had heard about dominant alpha presence, everyone had. It was the kind of thing whispered in Omega housing blocks like a warning or a myth. But he had never been in a room with 1 alpha of this weight, let alone 3. His lungs made a brief argument about whether to keep working. He won the argument. Barely. Cairo's eyes swept the warehouse in one pass. Took in the cracked concrete, the rust-stained shelving, the broken skylight. And then they found the children. A stillness moved through him. Not surprise. Something quieter than surprise. Something that looked more like pain being held at a distance through sheer discipline. His gaze moved from the boys to Varel. Stayed there. Varel did not step back. He didn't know why. Every survival instinct he had built over 22 years of living at the bottom of a world that didn't value him was screaming at him to drop his eyes. To move aside. To make himself smaller and less visible and less of a problem. But the boys were behind him. And stepping back meant stepping away from the boys. So he didn't move. Cairo walked forward. Measured steps. Every footfall deliberate. He stopped 6 feet away and looked down at Varel. because there was a height difference that couldn't be argued with, and then his eyes dropped, just for a moment, to the children tucked behind Varel's legs. One of the boys had grabbed the back of Varel's coat with both fists. Cairo looked at that for a long moment. Then back up. "You fed them," he said. His voice was low. Even. The kind of voice that didn't need volume because it had long since learned that volume was for people who weren't being listened to. And everyone in this man's life listened. Varel said nothing. He never said anything. But his chin lifted slightly. Which was, in its own way, an answer. Something shifted in Cairo's expression. A micro-movement at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile. More like recognition. The way you look at something unexpected and find yourself recalculating. Zephyr moved. He stepped around his brother without asking and covered the remaining distance fast, stopping just inside Varel's personal space, and the aggression coming off him wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. It was just there. Dense and certain, like a wall you could walk into. "Move," Zephyr said. Flat. No room for interpretation. Varel looked at him. Didn't move. The tension in the room spiked so hard that Cree made a sound, a small, frightened thing, and pressed his face into the back of Varel's knee. Zephyr's eyes dropped to the child. Something complicated crossed his face. Then his jaw tightened and he looked back at Varel. "I won't ask twice." Zephyr. Cairo's voice. No heat. No volume. But Zephyr stopped like he'd walked into glass. A beat. Cairo stepped forward until he was beside his brother, and the shift between them was wordless, Zephyr backing down an inch without appearing to, Cairo stepping into the space that created. "You're coming with us," Cairo said to Varel. Not loud. Not threatening in any obvious way. But it wasn't a question. Varel looked at the boys. Dax had both arms wrapped around his left leg now. Ren was watching Cairo with those two wide eyes, and he looked not terrified. Something stranger than terrified. Like someone looking at something they almost recognize. Varel looked back at Cairo. And shook his head. The silence that followed had weight. Darian, who had not moved from near the entrance, made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. More like the exhale of someone who had just been proven right about something. Zephyr's eyes went hard. But Cairo looked at Varel the way no one had looked at him in a very long time. Like he was worth the effort of figuring out. He took one more step closer. His voice dropped so only Varel could hear it. "You don't understand what you're protecting." A pause. Or what's coming for it. And then. Outside, sharp and sudden and close enough to rattle the corrugated walls. A single gunshot. The echo hadn't finished dying when Zephyr moved toward the door. Cairo put a hand on his chest. One hand. That was all. And Zephyr stopped. The warehouse went tight with waiting. All 6 of them, 3 kings and 3 small boys and 1 Omega who couldn't speak and wouldn't move, suspended in that half-second between the shot and whatever came next. Nothing. No second shot. No voices. No footsteps. Just the wind against the corrugated walls and the thin whistle of it through the broken skylight. Cairo didn't look away from Varel. And that was the thing Varel couldn't quite process. Not the gunshot. Not the 3 Alpha Kings standing in what had been his cold sanctuary. The thing that was hardest to hold was the fact that the most dangerous man in this room was looking at him with something that wasn't contempt. It wasn't kindness either. It was closer to curiosity. The focused, slightly narrowed kind. Like Varel was a problem he had not anticipated and hadn't yet decided how to solve. Dax tugged the back of Varel's coat. Varel reached back without looking and covered the boy's small hand with his own. Cairo watched that. "They won't go with us," Cairo said. Not to Varel. Half to himself, half to his brothers. They won't leave him. Then we take him too, Zephyr said from behind. Still sharp. Still looking at the door like the gunshot was unfinished business. We're not taking anyone. Darian finally spoke. His voice was different from his brother's, lower, more deliberate, each word landing like it had been selected from many options. He walked forward now, stopping a few paces back from where Cairo stood, and he looked at the boys for a long moment before his eyes moved to Varel. The question, Darian said, is why he's still here. Varel met his gaze. The question wasn't rude. It wasn't cruel. It was the honest version of what everyone had been thinking since they walked in. Because an Omega in an abandoned warehouse, starving and cold, with 3 children who weren't his, that didn't make sense. Not in this world. Not with the system that existed for people like Varel. The shelters. The placement programs. The so-called support structures that were mostly just ways to keep Omegas visible, trackable, and manageable. Varel hadn't used any of them. He'd come here instead. And stayed. Why? He didn't have an answer that would satisfy anyone in this room. The truth was too small. Too plain. He stayed because they needed him to. Because no one else was going to. Because the look in Dax's eyes on that first night had been something Varel recognized from the inside out, the look of a person who has stopped waiting for rescue and started waiting for the end. He hadn't been able to walk away from that. Protection isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet refusal to let go. Cairo was watching him. Not impatiently. Like he had time. You could have left, Cairo said. For days in a place like this, you had every reason to go. Varel looked at him and then deliberately, slowly, looked down at the 3 boys pressed against his legs. Cairo followed his gaze. And something happened in his face. Quick! Controlled immediately, tucked away behind the discipline of a man who had spent a long time learning not to show anything he didn't intend to show. But Varel caught it. Pain. Old. Specific. The kind that doesn't come from new wounds. They're mine, Cairo said. And this time it wasn't the word possession. It wasn't ownership. It was something rawer, the sound of someone claiming back something they had been afraid they'd already lost. Kree's grip on the back of Varel's coat tightened. None of the boys moved toward Cairo. Not one of them. And that, Varel could see it, that landed hard. Cairo's expression didn't fracture, but his stillness changed quality. Became heavier. Zephyr made a sound. Low. Almost a growl. He pushed off the wall and walked closer, stopping just behind Varel now, and the sudden proximity made the air thicken. They don't know us, Zephyr said, and there was something buried in those 4 words that wasn't anger. It was grief wearing anger's clothes. They've been gone almost 3 months. They should know us. 3 months. Varel filed that away. These children had been missing for 3 months. These 3 Alpha Kings, who moved like the world had been built to accommodate them, who wore power the way regular men wore coats, had been looking for 3 small boys for 3 months. And here those boys were. Safe. Because a mute Omega with $40 to his name and no plan had decided to stay. Cairo stepped closer now. Not aggressively. Carefully. Like approaching something that might startle. But he wasn't looking at the boys. He was looking at Varel. Studying him. Unhurried. The way Darian had, like a problem, but a different kind of problem. Not a threat. Something else. You kept them calm, Cairo said. How? Varel didn't answer. Obviously. He touched his own throat, briefly. One flat gesture. Cairo understood immediately, his expression shifted. Something moved through his eyes that wasn't pity but was in the neighborhood of it. Then how? Viral hesitated. Then he made a small, unconscious sound, barely audible. The low hum he used with the boys. Just a fragment of it. 3 seconds, maybe less. Ren turned his face up immediately. Like a reflex. And Dax, who had been pressed against Varel's leg, made a sound back. Tiny. Mimicking. The first sound any of the boys had made since the Alpha Kings entered. Cairo stared at that for a full 5 seconds. Then he looked at Varel and said nothing for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before. You're coming with us. This time it wasn't a command. It was closer to a plea wearing a command's voice. And Varel, against every warning system he had, felt something he hadn't felt in months. He felt like someone had actually seen him. Not the Omega. Not the mute. Not the liability. Him. He looked at the boys. They looked back at him. And he felt the choice forming inside his chest like something heavy shifting into a new position. Then the door at the far end of the warehouse, the side door, the one that faced the alley, shook once on its hinges. Hard. From the outside. The second hit against the door splintered the frame. No warning. No voice. Just force, organized and specific, the kind that comes from people who have done this before and stopped caring about the noise. Cairo moved first. He turned and had Varel by the upper arm before Varel had even finished processing what was happening, pulling him back and to the side in one motion, and the grip was firm without being rough, like a hand that knew the difference between protecting and hurting and had chosen one deliberately. Behind the shelving rack, Cairo said. To Varel. Not to his brothers. They were already moving. The side door blew open. For figures. Dark gear. Weapons already up. They came in fast and tight, covering the room in under 2 seconds with the kind of coordination that doesn't happen without serious training. The first one's flashlight beam cut across the warehouse and swept right over the spot where Varel and the boys had been sleeping for minutes ago. Zephyr was already across the room. Varel didn't see him move. Just saw the result. The first figure off balance, flashlight spinning away, and Zephyr hitting him again before he'd finished falling, controlled violence with no wasted motion whatsoever. Darian moved differently. Quieter. He put himself between the entrance and the back of the room without appearing to rush, and when the second figure came through, Darian wasn't where the flashlight expected him to be. Varel had the boys behind the shelving rack. All three pressed flat against the wall, as small as they could make themselves, and Varel was in front of them with both arms spread. His heart rate was doing something he couldn't regulate, spiking and not coming back down. This was his body's old response. Freeze first. Then vanish. That was the script his nervous system had written for situations like this over years of being the wrong kind of person in the wrong kind of place. He had survived by becoming very still and very invisible. But there was a shelving rack behind him. And the boys couldn't run. He couldn't freeze. Smoke began curling under the side door. Pale. Chemical. Then the smell hit, accelerant. Someone outside had set something lit against the building. Cree grabbed Varel's sleeve. Varel looked down. The boy's face was white and his eyes were fixed on the smoke like he'd seen fire before and had not forgotten it. Like the memory of it had never fully left. Varel covered Cree's hand with his. Squeezed. Cree looked up at him. And Varel held his gaze and breathed out slowly. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. Deliberately. Exaggeratedly. So the boy could see the pattern and follow it. Cree matched him. Shaking. But matching. Dax pressed his face into Varel's ribs. Ren stayed watching the room. Eyes moving the way Darian's eyes moved. Absorbing. Recording. A 3-year-old who looked at chaos the same way his father did, not panicking, just learning. The smoke thickened. Across the warehouse, something crashed. One of the figures going down against the metal shelving with enough weight to buckle the frame. Zephyr said nothing. He didn't need to. A voice from outside, through the broken side door. Male. Calm. Which was worse than loud. Take the Omega alive. Varel went cold. Not the boys. Not the heirs. Not the obviously powerful men dismantling the attackers with their bare hands. The Omega. Him. He had maybe 2 seconds to process this before one of the remaining figures broke from the main fight and came around the far side of the shelving rack, and then stopped when he saw Varel there with the 3 children, and his eyes moved over all 4 of them and landed on Varel with something like recognition. Like he'd been given a description. And this was it. Cairo appeared from the other side of the rack before the figure took a second step. What followed wasn't a fight in any conventional sense. It was Cairo's hand around the figure's collar and the figure off his feet and then on the floor, and then Cairo crouched at eye level with him. "Who sent you?" Cairo said. Not a question. Not loud. The figure said nothing. Cairo looked at him for 3 seconds. Then stood up. Looked at Varel. The warehouse was fully on fire now on one side, the heat rolling in from the corner where the back wall met the ceiling. The smoke was dropping fast. "Move," Cairo said. He reached for Varel's wrist. And Varel, whose entire body was running on the electric panic of 5 different survival responses hitting at once, yanked back. Just once. A reflex. Cairo stopped. Looked at him. There was fire moving toward them and shouting from outside and smoke pressing down on the room like a ceiling lowering, and Cairo Vos Ashford took 1 full second to just look at Varel. Like none of the rest of it existed right now. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. And it was the flatness of it that worked. Not a promise, he didn't dress it up. Just a statement. Calm as telling someone what time it was. Varel looked at the boys. "Pick them up," Cairo said. To himself and his brothers, not ordering Varel. And he and Derian moved to the children simultaneously, lifting all 3 with the practiced ease of people who had carried these specific small bodies before, holding them close in a way that looked automatic. Muscle memory. Ren made a small sound. Didn't fight. Dax looked back at Varel over Cairo's shoulder as they moved toward the main door. Eyes asking the same question they'd been asking since day 1. "You're coming, right?" And Varel, still processing that voice outside. "Take the Omega alive." Still trying to understand why. Still running his thumb over the inside of his own wrist where, without thinking about it, he'd been pressing his fingers all night. Followed. They got out through the main rolling door and into the cold air, and the black cars were already running, doors open, Zephyr covering their exit from behind. Varel was halfway to the second car when a hand closed around his arm. Not Cairo's hand. Someone else's. A figure from the alley side, one more, held back as insurance, pulling hard, and for a second the cold and the smoke and the firelight all collapsed into pure, bright panic in Varel's chest. Then Cairo was there. "Let him go," said to the figure. And the voice was still level, still controlled, but underneath it was something that had moved. Something that hadn't been there when he'd spoken to Varel a minute ago. Something that didn't have a calm name. The grip on Varel's arm disappeared. The figure disappeared. Cairo pulled Varel toward the car and the warehouse behind them lit the whole street orange as the roof caught. Varel looked back once. For days. Everything he'd had of his own. Gone. The door shut behind him and the car moved. And in the seat beside him, pressed against his arm, Dax fell asleep before they'd cleared the first block. Like going wherever Varel went was the same as being safe. The building had no name on the outside. Just a height and a lobby floor that was entirely white marble, lit from below, which should have looked cold but instead looked like something out of a dream where money had stopped being a concept and become an atmosphere. Vile had never been in a building like this. He stood in the elevator, glass-sided, rising fast, with all three boys asleep against him in various configurations, Dax sideways across his lap, Ren against his shoulder, Cree holding 2 fists of his sleeve. The elevator was big enough that he and Cairo and both of Cairo's brothers had room to stand without crowding, and it was still large. Cairo stood near the front panel. He hadn't spoken since the car. Zephyr stood near the back of the elevator, arms crossed, and his eyes moved from Varel to the sleeping boys and then away. Repeating. Darian was watching the city lights through the glass. The doors opened on the 43rd floor and the penthouse layout spread out in front of them, warm lighting, clean lines, floor-to-ceiling windows showing a skyline that looked like someone had arranged it for aesthetics. Heat. Real heat, the kind that reaches your skin before you're even fully through the door. Vile stepped in and felt it hit him. He hadn't realized how cold he'd been. Not just tonight. Not just from the warehouse fire. Deeper than that. The kind of cold that settles in when you've been surviving on the outside of warmth for so long that your body stops believing it's a real option. He stood in the entry and looked at the room. Rugs. Actual soft rugs. A couch wide enough to sleep for people. A kitchen where every surface was clean and there were groceries visible through the glass cabinet fronts, real groceries, not emergency quantities, just food sitting there available like it would always be there, like it didn't have to be rationed or protected. A bowl of fruit on the counter. Varel stared at that bowl of fruit for an embarrassing amount of time. Cairo turned and watched him do it. Didn't say anything. Varel transferred the boys, one by one, to the couch, tried to, anyway. Cree woke up when he was being moved and immediately sat back up and put his arms around Varel's neck and would not let go. Dax made a groggy complaint sound and reached for Varel's sleeve. Only Ren transferred fully, settling into the cushion and going back under immediately. Varel sat down on the edge of the couch with 2 of the 3 boys reattached to him and looked at the room again. Cairo had moved to the kitchen. He opened one of the cabinets, took something out. Set it on the counter. A plate. Real food. Something warm that he'd had heating, apparently, anticipating arrival. He carried it over and set it on the low table in front of Varel without ceremony. No explanation. No invitation. Just put it there and step back. Varel looked at it. Then up at Cairo. The alpha met his gaze and said nothing. Just stood there with his hands loose at his sides and waited. Varel looked back at the plate. This is what his nervous system had always called a trap. Safety offered too quickly. Comfort with no stated price. Because in Varel's life, there had always been a price. And when he couldn't see it, that meant it was hidden, which meant it was larger. Survival teaches you that comfort can be taken away faster than pain. He didn't eat. Darian came and stood near the window with a glass in his hand and watched the city. Zephyr had gone somewhere, down a hallway, another room. The sounds of the building settling. Heat running through vents. Traffic, muffled, 43 floors below. Quiet. Real quiet. Not the warehouse quiet of cold and absence. Warm quiet. Full quiet. Vile hated how good it felt. He hated that his body was relaxing against his will, shoulders dropping, jaw unclenching, some chronic tightness in his ribcage he'd stopped noticing starting to loosen. He hated it because he knew what came next. Hoping. And hoping was the most dangerous thing he did. He looked at the hallway. Then at the front door. He stood carefully. Cree made a small complaint, then settled back against Dax on the couch cushion, and Varel moved toward the entry. Stopped. The door had a panel beside it. Smooth. Dark. A number pad underneath a sensor. He reached for the handle. Nothing happened. He tried again. The door didn't move. He looked at the panel. The sensor glowed a faint, steady red. His hand dropped. He stood there for a moment with his back to the room, breathing through the sharp edge of something that wasn't quite panic but was shaped exactly like it. Then Cairo's voice, from behind him. "You're not a guest." Varel turned. Cairo was standing in the middle of the room, hands in the pockets of the dark coat he still hadn't taken off, and he was watching Varel with that same focused attention. Patient, measuring, the look of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and had decided exactly how much to reveal. Varel stared at him. Held the question in his eyes like an open hand. Then why? Cairo's gaze was steady. Flat. Certain. And then, quietly. Slowly. Each word placed down like something with deliberate weight. "You're under my protection." A pause. He let that settle. Then something shifted in his expression, not warmer, exactly. Differently weighted. Like that word, protection, meant something specific to him. Something with edges. Whether you want it or not. Across the room, Dax had woken up without anyone noticing. He was sitting up on the couch, looking at Cairo with those enormous dark eyes, those eyes that held entire conversations in the spaces between words. He wasn't scared. He was watching the Alpha the way Ren watched him. Like someone he almost remembers. And Varel, standing at a locked door with nowhere to go, looked at that small face, and understood, in the quiet that stretched between the four of them, that whatever this was, it had already started long before tonight. Long before the warehouse. Long before he'd found them. The question that pressed against the inside of his chest now, tight and cold and impossible to ignore. Did he find the boys? Or had someone made sure he would? Cairo set the photograph on the table without warning. No build-up. No explanation. Just placed it flat in front of Varel and stepped back and waited. It was a surveillance image. Grainy. Time-stamped 11 weeks ago. A warehouse, different from the one on Caldera Street, older, larger, and in the frame, 3 small boys being led through a side door by 2 figures whose faces had been deliberately obscured. Varel looked at the photo. Then up at Cairo. The Alpha was watching him with that steady, measured expression he seemed to wear like a second coat. Arms loose. Body still. Nothing in his posture that said urgency, but his eyes were doing something different. They were asking. 11 weeks, Cairo said. That's how long they were gone before we found where they'd ended up. Varel looked back at the photo. The boys in the image were thinner than they'd been even in the warehouse. Much thinner. And their posture. The way they were walking was that specific, too careful stillness that comes after something has happened that a child's body remembers even when the mind tries to move past it. Varel's jaw tightened. You didn't find them, Cairo said. We did. Eventually. But by the time we traced the last location, they were already gone again. A pause. They ended up on Caldera Street. We don't know how. He pulled out a second photograph. Set it beside the first. This one showed the inside of the first warehouse. A cot. Food containers. Small toys arranged neatly in a row along a shelf. Someone had been taking care of them. Before Varel. Someone moved them, Darian said. He was across the room, standing against the bookcase with his arms crossed, and he spoke like he'd been waiting for the right moment to add this specific piece. Relocated them twice. Fed them. Kept them alive and hidden. Varel looked at the toys in the photograph. 3. Arranged in a precise line. Identical spacing between them. Just like the boys. Here's the part that matters, Cairo said. Varel looked up. The people who took them weren't trying to hurt them. Not directly. He moved to the chair across from the couch and sat down, elbows on his knees, which was the first time Vial had seen him fold any part of himself into something that looked like exhaustion. They were using them as leverage. There are people who want to destabilize what we control. Our territories, our alliances, our supply lines. Taking the heirs was a message. A beat. Keeping them alive was the message too. Dead children make enemies. Living ones make bargaining chips. Zephyr, from near the kitchen doorway, said nothing. His jaw was set so tight it looked structural. Vial looked at the three boys asleep on the wide couch, Dax and Cree curled together, Ren flat on his back with one arm over his face. Looking at them now, in this warm room with real light, they just looked small. Not dangerous. Not heirs to anything. Just small. And someone had used that smallness as a weapon. He felt something move through his chest. Not sympathy. Sharper than that. More specific. He looked at Cairo. The Alpha was watching him. You kept them alive, Cairo said. Quietly. For 4 days. In the cold. With nothing. A pause. No one told you to. No one paid you. No one even knew you were there. Vial held his gaze. Why? And here was the thing about that question. The reason it sat so differently than all the other questions of the night. Cairo was not asking because he wanted ammunition. He was not asking because he was building a file. He was asking the way a person asks when they genuinely do not understand something and it is keeping them awake. Vial reached down and carefully, slowly, pulled the edge of Dax's blanket up over his shoulder where it had slipped. The boy stirred. Settled. Vial looked back at Cairo. And let that be the answer. Something crossed Cairo's face. Quick! Moved through and was gone. But Vial caught it. And it was unguarded. For just that second. The kind of expression a person makes when something unexpected touches something real. Cairo stood up. Walked to the window. Stood with his back to the room for a moment. You stepped into a war you didn't know existed, he said. You took care of the most important targets in a multi-territory conflict. And now the people on the other side of that conflict know you exist. He turned. They know your face. They had a description of you before the warehouse burned, which means someone was watching Caldera Street before tonight. Vial went still. Before tonight. They had been watching before tonight. Before the attack. Before the fire. Before the Alpha Kings arrived. Someone had been watching him with the boys and had said nothing. Had waited. For what? You're not in danger because of what happened tonight, Darian said from across the room. Even. Precise. You were already in danger. Tonight just made it visible. The room was quiet. Outside, 43 floors down, the city moved the way cities always move, indifferent and continuous and completely unaware of the specific weight settling into this specific room. Vial looked at the locked front door. Then back at Cairo. The Alpha crossed the room. Stopped in front of Varel, not close enough to crowd, but close enough that there was no pretending this was anything other than direct. He reached out. His hand came up slow, deliberate, no sudden movements, like he was aware of every reason Varel might pull away, and his fingers came to rest under Varel's chin. Not grabbing. Not forcing. Just present. The lightest possible contact. Tilting his face up. Making him meet his eyes. You kept them alive, Cairo said again. And this time the words were different. Lower. Like the statement had been sitting in him for hours and had just now found its way out. His thumb moved. Once. Against Varel's jaw. Vile's breath stopped. Cairo's eyes dropped to his mouth. Then back up. Why, he said again. And this time it wasn't about the children at all. 3 days passed. They were the strangest 3 days of Varel's life, which, given the competition, was saying something. The penthouse operated on rhythms he didn't understand yet. Cairo left early and came back late, always with the contained energy of someone who had spent 12 hours making decisions that affected hundreds of people and was now walking back into a room and choosing to set all of that down. Zephyr moved through the space like he was calculating exits. Darian read, mostly. Physical books, which surprised Varel, stacked on the table beside the window in a leaning column that grew and shifted daily. And the boys. The boys woke up on that first morning in the penthouse and did not immediately go to the 3 men who were, apparently, their fathers. They went to Varel. All 3. Before their eyes were fully open. Moving across the wide room with that half-asleep, unerring certainty of children who have decided where safe is and do not question it. Dax climbed into Varel's lap and went back to sleep. Cree sat beside him and leaned his head on Varel's arm. Ren stood in front of him for a moment, looking at him with those absorbing eyes, and then held out the small red toy car he'd been clutching since they left the warehouse. An offering. Varel took it carefully. Turned it over in his hands. Handed it back. Ren nodded like this had been a test and sat down at his feet. Cairo had been watching from the kitchen doorway. His coffee sat untouched on the counter. He watched the 4 of them for a long moment, and then he picked up his coffee and turned away and looked out the window instead. Zephyr said, that same morning, this is a problem. Not to anyone specific. Just out loud. Standing in the living room with his arms crossed, staring at the arrangement of 3 small children orbiting a silent omega like planets around a sun they had chosen without permission. Darian, without looking up from his book, said, "You thought it would be easy." "I thought they'd remember us." "They do," Darian said. "That's not the same as trust." Zephyr looked at him. "He has what we don't," Darian continued. "Time. Presence. He was there when we weren't. This is the thing about power. It can open every door in a city. It can move armies. It can make people comply through fear and make systems bend through force. It cannot make a 3-year-old feel safe. Only presence does that. Only consistency. Only showing up when the cold is real and the hunger is real and staying anyway." Zephyr knew this. Varel could see it in the way the man looked at the boys, not angry at Varel, exactly. Angry at the 11 weeks. Angry at the distance. Angry that someone else had filled a space that should have been his. And there was nothing in the world to do about that except live with it and move forward. By the second day, the observation began. Vile noticed it because he noticed most things. Cairo watching him from across the room when Varel was humming to Cree. Zephyr leaning against the doorframe when Varel showed Dax how to stack the small colored block someone had brought in. Darian looking up from his book at specific moments. The moments when Varel did something quiet and unremarkable, like smoothing Ren's hair back or adjusting Dax's collar without being asked. They were watching him. Not suspiciously. Something else. On the second afternoon, Cairo sat beside him on the couch while the boys napped, sat close, not touching, but within range of the warmth that comes off a person, and opened his laptop and worked without saying anything. For an hour. 2 hours. Just there. Like proximity was a language he was trying. Vile didn't move away. On the 3rd morning, one of Cairo's people, a tall woman named Sable Trent who moved through rooms like weather and apparently ran the security detail, pulled Zephyr aside in the hallway outside the main room and spoke in a low, clipped voice. Vile caught 3 words. His name. Not his actual name. The word omega, used the way people use it when they're talking about a category, not a person. And liability. He knew that word well. had heard it applied to himself more times than he could count. From shelters that didn't have room. From placement programs that didn't have funding. From systems that looked at someone like him, no voice, no pack, no documented history, and did a calculation and came up short. Liability. The word settled in his chest like something familiar. He looked at the boys. He looked at the locked front door. He thought about what Darian had said 3 nights ago. You were already in danger. And he thought about what it would mean to leave. To find a way out of this building and back into the city and disappear again, the way he had always disappeared, moving from one barely safe place to the next. He could do that. He'd been doing that for years. But then Dax looked up from the blocks and found Varel's face across the room and smiled. Small. Automatic. The smile of a child who has decided, without needing reasons, that this person is a permanent fixture in the world. Varel looked at that smile. And the thought of leaving became complicated in a way that felt physical. That evening, Sable came to Cairo with a tablet and they looked at something together by the window, voices low, faces serious. Zephyr joined them. Darian put down his book. Varel couldn't hear the specifics. But he watched Cairo's face. Watched the moment something in it shifted, that controlled expression tightening, then smoothing back out deliberately, the way a man tightens a grip when something surprises him and doesn't want anyone to see the surprise. Cairo looked up from the tablet. Found Varel's eyes across the room. Held them. Then he looked at his brothers and said something. Zephyr shook his head. Cairo said it again. One word. Final. And Zephyr's jaw went tight and he said, flatly, across the room, in a voice he didn't bother to lower. He's a liability. The word landed exactly where it always did. But this time, Cairo didn't look at Zephyr when he answered. He was still looking at Varel. His mine. 2 words. Said without heat. Without performance. Without a single wasted syllable. Like a fact that had already been decided and was only now being said out loud. And Varel, who had spent 22 years being nobody's anything, stood in the middle of a room that wasn't his and felt those 2 words hit the inside of his chest like a fist pressed flat against a door. He didn't know what they meant yet. He didn't know if they were a promise or a trap. But he felt them. And so did everyone else in the room. It happened at 2:17 in the morning. Varel was awake. He was often awake at that hour. It was one of the lasting effects of years of sleeping in places where you couldn't fully sleep. He was sitting on the floor beside the wide couch where all 3 boys were out cold, back against the cushions, Dax's small hand resting on his shoulder in the careless way children hold on even in sleep. The building had a specific quiet at 2 a.m. The ventilation system ran on a lower cycle. The traffic 43 floors down thinned to almost nothing. Which was why he heard the elevator. Not the sound of it, the elevator was nearly silent. What he heard was the pressure change. That same shift he'd felt in the warehouse. The subtle but undeniable weight of someone, multiple someones, moving into a space they weren't invited into. He was on his feet before the thought finished forming. The elevator opened. They came out fast. 4 of them. Dark clothes, no identifiers, weapons already up and moving. And the 2 men from Cairo security who had been stationed in the lobby were not behind them, which meant the lobby was already gone. Varel grabbed Dax first. The boy came awake immediately, no crying, just his whole body going rigid and his eyes snapping open, and the steadiness in those 3-year-old eyes was the kind of thing that should not have to exist in a 3-year-old and did anyway. Varel pressed 2 fingers to his own lips. Dax understood. He grabbed Kree's arm. Kree's eyes opened. Same signal. Same understanding. Ren was already sitting up. These boys had learned silence as survival before Varel ever found them. He moved all 3 to the back of the couch, low, and had them pressed into the narrow gap between the sofa and the wall, the least visible position in the room, before the first figure cleared the entry hallway. The lights in the penthouse were off. Floor-to-ceiling windows. Skyline glow. Enough to see by, not enough to move fast in. The first figure swept the room with a mounted light. Beam crossing the kitchen, the bookcase, the dining table, the empty couch. Vial held completely still. The beam passed him. Moved on. Then stopped. Came back. Slower. The figure was 3 feet away and moving closer when the ceiling lights came on, all of them, all at once, the sudden white blaze of it after darkness, and Zephyr came through the hallway door at speed. What happened in the next 45 seconds was not a fight in any sense Varel had words for. Zephyr moved through the room like the room was already his, and these people had simply not received the news yet. No wasted motion. No pause between actions. Each contact deliberate and conclusive. The second figure went for him and Zephyr redirected, used the momentum, and the figure hit the bookcase so hard 3 of Darian's books fell off the shelf. Cairo came in behind him. Darian came from the kitchen side. 3 alphas. For intruders. The math resolved in under a minute. But one of them, the last one, the one who had been covering the door, turned his head and looked straight at the gap behind the couch. Looked straight at Varel. And smiled. Varel registered the smile and understood what it meant before the man even moved. Not panic. Clarity. Sharp, immediate clarity. He pressed his hands against all 3 boys, keeping them flat. The man reached the couch in 3 steps. Varel stood up. Cree made a sound, cut off immediately, swallowed back down, because these children had learned, and Varel stepped sideways, away from them, drawing the man's eyes away from where the boys were. The man stopped. Tilted his head. There you are, he said. Cairo looked up from across the room. His eyes went to Varel. Then to the man standing 2 feet from him. And something happened in Cairo's face. Not the control tightening Varel had seen before. Something looser. More immediate. He moved. The man had a weapon up before Cairo covered half the distance, but Cairo didn't slow. He hit the man's arm at the elbow, redirecting the barrel, and then he was between Varel and the threat with his back to Varel, completely, as if placing himself as a wall was the most obvious thing in the world. The fight was over in seconds. The room went quiet. Cree started crying. Low. Contained. The cry of a child who held it until the holding was no longer necessary. Vial went to him immediately. The 3 boys came out from behind the couch and pressed against him all at once, all 3, no hesitation, and Varel went down on one knee and gathered them in, both arms wide. Cairo was breathing harder than normal. He turned and looked at Varel on the floor with all 3 boys. His eyes moved over them, checking, cataloguing, looking for hurt. Then his eye settled on Varel. You moved away from them, he said. Vial met his gaze. You drew him off. Cairo's voice had changed. Not softer. More stripped. Like everything practiced had been removed and this was what was left underneath. Vial looked back at the boys. Sable Trent appeared in the doorway with 4 more of Cairo's people and started working the room without being asked. The man who had smiled at Varel, who had known exactly who to look for, was zip-tied by the bookcase. Darian crouched in front of him. Patient. Inevitable. The man looked up at him. The Omega is worth more than the heirs, he said. Like this was information Darian should appreciate. Like he was doing them a favor by sharing it. Darian looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Cairo. And the thing that moved between them, wordless, immediate, was not confusion. It was recognition. They had suspected this. They had suspected there was something more to Varel's presence in that warehouse. Something that wasn't coincidence. Something arranged. And now this man, this confirmed operative for the people who had taken the boys, was sitting zip-tied on the floor of their penthouse, confirming it openly. Worth more than the heirs. Cairo turned back to Varel. And this time the question in his eyes wasn't the same question he'd been asking all week. It was bigger. Older. The kind of question that had been waiting in the dark at the back of the file. He just hadn't opened it yet. Now he had to. Sable Trent put a tablet in Cairo's hand at 6 in the morning, and the look on her face said everything before her mouth did. We found the origin point, she said. Where the boys were first taken. Cairo looked at the screen. Then he looked at Varel, who was across the room, and something in his expression shifted in a way Varel had not seen before on his face. Like a door Cairo had been holding shut had just opened a crack from the other side. Sit down, Cairo said. To Varel. Not a command this time. The other version. Varel Saturday. Sable pulled up the information on the wall screen, a large display that unfolded from the ceiling panel like it had been waiting for exactly this moment. Varel watched the data come up and understood some of it and didn't understand the rest and kept his face still either way. Maps. Photographs. A timeline marked in red. And a name he didn't recognize. But a symbol he did. Small. Precise. A crown split into 3 equal sections. The same mark on the boy's wrists. His hand moved to his own wrist without thinking. Press there. Old reflex. Sable was talking. Her voice was measured and clipped, and she moved through the information without slowing for emotional impact, because emotional impact wasn't her job, information was. The boys had been taken by a faction called the Triune Claim. Underground. Old money and older debts, operating through a network that stretched across 6 city districts and 3 international territories. Their goal wasn't simple theft. Wasn't ransom. They were trying to collapse the Voss-Ashford succession structure, eliminate the heirs, fracture the Alpha bloodline, destabilize the alliance system that had kept for territories in an uncomfortable but functional peace for the last decade. The boys were the lever. But they needed to hold the lever long enough for it to work. Which meant they needed to keep them alive. Which meant they had moved them twice. Careful. Intentional. Maintaining the children's survival while using them as an ongoing threat rather than a single act. Varel tracked all of this. Watched the timeline. Watched it approach the date 11 weeks ago when someone had left the boys in the second location. Then 4 days ago when someone had brought them to Caldera Street. He watched Sable's mouth and he watched the timeline and he felt the shape of the thing assembling itself in his chest before the words came. We tracked the movement, Sable said. Both relocations. Same handler. Same route. We have the name, Corvin Bray. Low-level operative, been on our radar for 8 months. She paused. Here's where it changes. Corvin Bray has a documented contact list. 11 people. We ran cross-references on all of them against our current situation. She advanced the slide. 1 name. 1 photograph. And a document, a financial record, a transfer, a series of communications that connected that name to the Triune Claim, to Corvin Bray, and to the location of a shelter on the north side of the city. A shelter Varel had stayed at 4 weeks ago. Varel felt the room shift. Not physically. But in the way it does when you realize the ground you were standing on was built on something else and has been the whole time. Someone in that shelter reported your location, Darian said. He wasn't looking at the screen. He was looking at Varel. They passed it to Bray. Bray moved the boys to Caldera Street after confirming you were in the area. A pause. You were brought to them. Not the other way around. The warehouse. The 3 boys. The cold and the quiet and the way they had been exactly where he would find them. Arranged. Not abandoned. Arranged. Vile sat with that for a full 10 seconds. He pressed his hands flat on his knees to keep them still. They knew your history, Cairo said. He had been standing near the window and now he moved closer, not rushing, moving with that careful deliberateness that Vile had learned meant he was dealing with something he didn't want to get wrong. Omegas without pack, without voice, without documentation, people who survive by staying invisible. You fit the profile they were building. The profile. They wanted someone who would take the boys in, Darian said. Someone who wouldn't go to authorities. Someone who wouldn't make noise. Someone who the boys would trust fast enough to stay calm, because calm children are easier to track and recover. They were going to use you as a carrier, Sable said. Flat. Not cruel. Just precise. You take the boys in, keep them stable, and then when the claim was ready to move, they retrieve all of you at once. 3 targets in 1 location. Vile thought about the voice outside the burning warehouse. Take the Omega alive. Not the boys. Him. Because the boys were already accounted for in the plan. But if Vile had done something they hadn't expected, if he'd bonded to the boys in a way that made him fight, then he became a variable. A variable worth recovering. Worth more than the heirs. Not because of who he was. Because of what he'd become to the boys without anyone planning that part. The room was very quiet. Vile looked at his hands. He thought about day 1. The gas station sandwich broken into 3 pieces. Ren handing his piece to Cree. The specific quality of the silence in that building, how it had felt like recognition. He hadn't been chosen for his strength. He'd been chosen because they calculated he was easy. Forgettable. Movable. Invisible. A tool. His jaw tightened. He looked up. Found Cairo's eyes. And whatever was in his own face at that moment. Varel felt it rising, something that was not grief exactly and not anger exactly but lived right where those 2 things share a wall. Cairo held his gaze. Didn't look away. Didn't fill the silence with words. Just stayed in it with him. Varel exhaled. Long, slow. Down to the bottom. And then his eyes stung. He hadn't cried in months. Possibly longer. The mechanics of it were unfamiliar, not dramatic, not loud. Just a single line of heat moving down one side of his face, which he registered and did not move to stop. Because the boys had been real. That was the thing. Whatever the plan had been. Whatever they had calculated and arranged and set in motion. The hunger had been real. The cold had been real. The sound Ren made when he handed that first piece of food to his brother instead of eating it himself, that had been completely, irreversibly real. And Vile had stayed because of that. Not because of any calculation. Because of that. Cairo crossed the room. Stopped in front of him. Crouched down until they were level. Eye to eye. And Varel noticed, up close, that whatever Cairo had been carrying since the boys came home, the tension of 11 weeks, the weight of a war still unresolved, the discipline it took to hold all of that and still function, it was present in the lines around his eyes in a way that had nothing to do with age. He lifted his hand. Touched the side of Varel's face. His palm. Warm. Varel didn't pull back. You were meant to be used, Cairo said quietly. That was their plan. A pause. They miscalculated. Vile looked at him. Because you were real with them, Cairo said. And they didn't account for that. They built a plan around an Omega who would stay quiet and compliant and invisible. His thumb moved. Against Varel's cheekbone. And what they got was you. From behind them. The small, half-awake sound of Dax stirring on the couch. Then Cree's voice. Low. Still mostly asleep. saying a word. The first word Vile had ever heard any of them speak. Vile. Calling for him by the name they hadn't been told. Somehow knowing it anyway. Cairo heard it. Closed his eyes for 1 second. Opened them. You didn't just save them, he said. Pause. Long. The kind of pause that carries more weight than most sentences. You were meant to be found. And underneath that, underneath the truth of it, the arranged nature of it, the plan and the manipulation and the calculation, was the other truth. The one that lived right beside it. He had been found. And he had stayed anyway. Which meant something. Something the triune claim had not planned for. Something that couldn't be undone. The call came at midnight. Not a threat. A declaration. Sable Trent put it on speaker in the main room without preamble, and the voice on the other end was composed, male, and unhurried, the voice of someone who has decided this is already over and is simply notifying the other parties. You have until morning, the voice said. Deliver the heirs and the Omega to the location we've sent, or we move to the next phase. Cairo stood in the center of the room with his arms at his sides. Next phase, Zephyr said. Flat. Almost a question, except his voice didn't move at the end. Darian was already at the table, pulling up the map they'd received. He looked at it for 4 seconds. Set it down. 17 operatives. 2 entry points. Ground level and roof. He looked at his brothers. They've been positioned since 9. Sable was already moving. Cairo looked at Varel. Varel was on his feet. He'd been on his feet since the call started. All 3 boys behind him. Awake, quiet, pressed in that specific formation they held when threat was real. Triangle. Varel at the point. He had not been told to stand there. He just stood there. Cairo walked toward him. Stopped at arm's length. You don't have to be in this room for what happens next, he said. Varel shook his head. One clear, certain movement. Cairo looked at him. Vile. The first time he had used his name. Not the Omega. Not him. Not a pronoun or a gesture or a category. His name. Varel held his gaze and shook his head again. And Cairo, for the first time since Varel had known him, smiled. Small. Not triumphant. The quiet kind. The kind you don't perform. He turned to his brothers. Positions. What followed was coordinated in a way that Varel could only partly follow. Sable's team took the exits. Darian covered the communications. Zephyr went to the roof access with 2 others, and the look on his face was the specific look of a man who has been waiting 3 days to do something conclusive. The building went to lockdown, not the standard night setting. Something harder. Sable moved through the space with the calm of someone who has planned for exactly this version of exactly this night. The boy stayed with Varel. He had them in the interior room. No windows, reinforced door, which Sable had walked him through, identifying on their second day here without explaining why at the time, and he sat with his back against the door and all 3 boys in front of him, and he waited. He was good at waiting. Cree pressed his face against Varel's collarbone and breathed. Ren held the red toy car with both hands. Dax looked at the door and then at Varel and said, without questioning it, okay. His second word. After Varel's name. Okay. Said like the presence of one person made a locked room in the middle of an assault survivable. Varel covered all 3 of them with his arms and held on. Outside, the sounds of what was happening moved through the building in waves, not loud, not cinematic. Real sounds. Quick. Structural. The sounds of a conflict being resolved by people who were better at it than the people on the other side. It took 18 minutes. Then Cairo's voice, outside the door. It's done. Varel opened the door. Cairo was there. Coat gone. A cut on the side of his jaw, small, already clotting. He looked at the boys first. All three, one by one. Then at Varel. Triune claims core leadership is in custody, he said. The rest won't move without them. A pause. It's over. Varel looked at the cut on his face. Reached up, slowly, giving him every chance to move back, and touched the edge of it with his fingers. Light. Just checking. Cairo went completely still. Zephyr appeared at the end of the hallway, breathing harder than usual, and stopped when he saw Varel's hand on Cairo's face. Something moved in his expression, complicated, several things at once, and then he looked away. Darian came around the corner, tablet in hand, and saw the same thing and said nothing and kept walking. Cairo looked at Varel's hand on his face. Then at Varel. The boy spilled into the hallway. Dax immediately at Cairo's knee, looking up at him with those enormous dark eyes, and something happened that Varel hadn't seen yet. Cairo looked down at him. Crouched. And Dax, slowly, with the deliberateness of a choice being made, put both arms around Cairo's neck. The sound that came out of Cairo was involuntary. Low. Pressed back immediately. But there. Cree watched. Then walked forward. Put his hand on Cairo's shoulder. Ren stayed where he was for a moment longer. Looked at his father. Looked at Varel. Then at his father again, like he was measuring something, calculating in the way he always calculated. Then he walked forward and sat down on Cairo's knee and leaned back against his chest. Cairo's arms came around all three of them at once. His eyes closed. And Varel stood in the hallway of a locked-down penthouse 43 floors above a city that was going to have to be explained in the morning, and watched three small boys finally come home. The ache in his chest was not grief. It was something next door to it. The feeling of watching something be restored. Something you helped hold in place until the real owners could get back. He should feel like he could leave now. That was the thought. The reason he'd told himself was gone. He watched Cairo hold his sons and thought, I should feel like I can go. He didn't. He didn't feel anything like leaving. Cairo opened his eyes. Found Varel's face across the hallway. He stood up. Carefully, boys still attached, Dax riding his side like it was the most natural position in the world, and he crossed the distance between them. Stopped close. The way he'd done before. That deliberate, no pretending proximity. His free hand came up. Found Varel's collar. Held it. Not pulling. Not pushing. Just holding. The cut on his jaw had stopped bleeding. His eyes were the same temperature they'd been since the first night in the warehouse. Controlled, certain, looking at Varel like he was a problem worth all the effort of solving. You saved what belongs to me, he said. Varel held his gaze. Cairo's grip on his collar shifted. Slight. Not tighter. Just more deliberate. Like an intention clarifying itself. His voice dropped. Now you're mine too. And there was nothing in the building that moved. Nothing from the boys? Dax asleep against Cairo's shoulder, Cree at his knee, Ren watching Varel with those camera eyes and the small, certain expression of a child who already knew how this was going to go. Nothing from Zephyr at the end of the hall. Nothing from Darian in the room beyond. Just Varel, standing in this place that had been a cage and a shelter and a battlefield and was now something else entirely, something he didn't have a name for yet. And Cairo, holding his collar like something found, and saying the truest, plainest thing. Varel lifted his eyes. And this time, he didn't look at the locked door. He looked at the man in front of him. And he stayed. The sound came from everywhere. Single. Sharp. A gunshot. loud enough to stop the air in the room. And then silence. Complete. No one moved. No one spoke. The hallway stretched out between the bodies of people who hadn't yet had time to understand what just happened or who it touched. Dax lifted his head from Cairo's shoulder, looked at the space between his father and Varel. And the question on his 3-year-old face was the same question hanging in every other face in that hallway. Who went down? If this story moved something in you, if you've ever protected someone who couldn't protect themselves, or found safety in the most unexpected place, drop a comment below and tell us your story. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And if you want to be here when the next chapter drops, subscribe right now and hit the bell so you don't miss a single update. Stories like this one keep coming, and this community is where they live. Share this with someone who needs it. You never know whose day you're about to change.